at you. Nice to know me. What's the message? Will you show me?
Quite a lot of people appear to have taken issue with my comments about the Gilet Jaunes. So let's expand a little. A lot of the criticism seems to be centered around the fact that I characterize myself as an ideological anarchist. People always seem to forget that I always qualify that by saying that I'm a pragmatist. So when I describe myself as an ideological anarchist, I'm saying I want the maximum possible amount of freedom for the largest possible number of people. The way to achieve that is not necessarily tearing down every structure that exists, every governmental or cooperative union that exists. It doesn't necessarily mean doing away with all authority. If you did away with law enforcement, for example, at least in a scarcity economy, then an oppressive force would arise of criminal barons, essentially, taking what they want from anybody who wouldn't have the protection that comes from a cooperative structure like law enforcement. Yeah, these are kind of deep issues that underlie a lot of the political ideologies that we might otherwise talk about or subscribe to. So, while I'm ideologically an anarchist, pragmatically, I'm more of a non-Marxian socialist, shall we say. So here's some guiding principles that lead me to where I am on the Gilet Jaunes protests. I want the greatest amount of freedom for the greatest number of people, as I've just outlined. I believe that the only justifiable reason to enforce something on people is harm. The harm principle. We typically discuss that here with regards to free expression and so on. And it's hard to demonstrate that speech or expression actually harms anyone. But there are instances where harm does occur. If you straight up murder a fool, that's an example of harm. And so we're justified in laying down rule structures and enforcement to prevent you from just randomly murdering people and so on, using extremes for an example. I also, as anyone with a lick of sense does, appreciate and understand that the climate change issue is now much more imminent and worse than many of us thought or hoped. We have much less time to do something about it before it rips apart our societies. We're also facing a lot of other issues to do with demography, overpopulation, and so on. So if I want the greatest amount of freedom for the greatest number of people, you have to start at a kind of baseline level of freedoms, and without being alive, you can't enjoy any of the other potential freedoms that are possible. If we don't change our course, there's going to be an enormous amount of harm, not just to us as individuals, not just to us as nations, but to humanity as a species. We are now facing an existential crisis, a threat to our existence as a species, and eschatological event, an extinction event, just a slow rolling one, which is perhaps why we're unwilling to tackle it. And I still worry that we won't start to tackle it until it's genuinely catastrophic, at which point it's probably too late to do anything about it. So keeping all that in mind, these protests started over a rather modest rise in fuel taxes. Now, I already covered that this isn't the best way to go about tackling this problem. It doesn't have that much of a suppressive effect on fuel use and so on, but still, this is the point. they attempted to raise the fuel taxes to better represent their actual societal and global cost, to offset some of the cost, to raise more revenue, hopefully, to put into investment in electrical infrastructure and things like that. This would still be paying less than the UK does, but it was showing willing on the environmental issue, at least a little. It was a lazy, quick, easy way to go about it, but it was still showing willing. And great political capital was made of this, as compared with Trump, who still dismisses climate change. And this tiny little increase sparked off these riots. This, in a very liberal, very educated, very progressive, really, Western nation that accepts climate change is an issue amongst the general populace. And this is kind of a weather vane for our hopes of doing anything about this in the future. So if France, this nation that can be characterized in this way, if they are incapable of doing even the smallest thing to even just indicate that they're willing to do something to challenge this global issue, this species level issue, if they're unable to push that through without massive rioting and burning cars and looting and everything else, then what hope for the rest of us? What hope for America to do anything about it, where there isn't the general scientific consensus amongst the general population that this is a genuine thing and a problem, even though America's probably one of the most developed nations that's already being hit the hardest by climate change. So, am I contemptuous of these people? Yes. There's no sense of self-preservation. There's no willingness to sacrifice. And if we are going to cope with this eschatological event that's incoming, it's going to take a great deal of sacrifice from everyone, rich, poor, black, white, European, American, Middle Eastern, African, Asian, everywhere. And it's going to take unprecedented levels of cooperation on the international stage as well. None of us can do it alone. We're stronger together, and we're necessarily stronger together if we want to deal with this. So if a developed, enlightened, Western European nation cannot do even the slightest thing to tackle this, then what hope do we have? Now, the protests have since expanded into other things, and the extremes of both left and right have joined in and sparked some of the violence and so forth. But it doesn't change my central point here, is that if we're unwilling to take even the slightest bit of pain that's necessary to secure our futures, then we have no hope as a species of surviving this. So this is extremely depressing, and ironically, it's the mob baying at the gate demanding that they be allowed cake, while this time it's the government saying maybe we should just have bread. So that's my thinking. A society can only be as liberal and free and open as it can afford to be. And a little pain now will secure our freedom in the future. I don't know how to put it more plainly than that. I mean, the broader protests I have more sympathy with, but this central initial spark, this central point, the first point to it all, yeah, I'm contemptuous, as I would be of anyone that refused to do even the slightest thing to help themselves.
Whatever you're looking for, hey, don't come around here